The prisoners expected another quiet stop along a dusty Texas road when the truck slowed beside a small roadside diner, glowing with warm light in the evening. Yet the moment they stepped down and looked through the wide front windows, something immediately felt wrong. Because inside the building, civilians were sitting calmly at long counters eating large plates of food, while waitresses moved between the tables carrying more dishes from the kitchen. And for men who had spent months living on simple camp meals, the scene looked almost unreal. So unreal that several of the prisoners quietly exchanged the same uneasy thought that the entire display might have been arranged for them. As if the Americans wanted captured soldiers to believe that ordinary people in Texas could still eat like this while the world remained at war. The truck rolled to a slow stop beside the narrow gravel lot in front of the diner, and the prisoners climbed down carefully one by one while the warm glow from the building's windows spilled across the ground beneath their boots. The sign above the entrance buzzed softly in the evening air, its electric lights reflecting against the glass windows that revealed a busy interior filled with people sitting along a long counter and several small tables arranged near the walls. For a moment, the prisoners simply stood there in silence, adjusting to the unexpected sight before them. Carl Ritter stepped down from the truck and looked toward the entrance with the cautious curiosity that had followed him through many unfamiliar experiences since his capture. The building itself appeared simple from the outside, a low structure with wide windows and a door that opened directly onto the main road. Yet the activity inside made it feel far more lively than anything he had seen since arriving in America. Customers sat comfortably along the counter, while others leaned back in wooden booths speaking with one another in relaxed voices. Through the glass, Carl could see plates being carried from the kitchen area by a woman wearing a light-colored apron, and the sight of those dishes immediately caught his attention because they looked unusually large compared with the meals the prisoners received inside the camp. Steam rose gently from several plates while the customers continued talking and eating without any sign of hurry. The guards allowed the prisoners to stand for a moment near the truck while they spoke briefly with a man who appeared to be the owner of the diner. During that short pause, the prisoners had time to observe the scene more carefully, and the details inside the building slowly became clearer as their eyes adjusted to the lighting. A long counter stretched along one side of the room with tall stools placed evenly in front of it, and several customers sat there eating meals while speaking casually with the waitress as she moved between them. Behind the counter, Carl could see shelves holding glass jars and small containers arranged neatly beside a metal machine that hummed quietly while someone prepared drinks. The smell of cooking drifted through the open doorway each time it swung inward, and the scent of warm food reached the prisoners standing outside. The mixture of grilled meat, fresh bread, and coffee created an atmosphere that felt strangely comforting and unfamiliar at the same time. Carl noticed that several of the civilians inside the diner had begun glancing toward the window where the prisoners stood gathered beside the truck. Their expressions showed curiosity rather than hostility, and some continued eating while watching the unusual group of soldiers observing the building from outside. Behind Carl, two prisoners spoke quietly in German, commenting that the entire place looked far too comfortable for a country involved in a global war. In the towns they remembered from Germany, restaurants had gradually grown quieter as food shortages increased and regulations tightened around what businesses were allowed to serve. Here the opposite seemed to be happening. Customers continued arriving at the diner even as the prisoners watched. A car pulled into the lot, and two men stepped out before walking directly toward the entrance with the relaxed confidence of people expecting a normal evening meal. Carl studied the plates on the tables once again as the door opened briefly, noticing how the portions of food appeared generous rather than carefully measured. The sight created a quiet tension in his mind because the quantity alone suggested that the diner had access to more ingredients than he had imagined possible during wartime. One of the prisoners murmured that the Americans might have chosen this particular place to impress them, arranging the display of food so that captured soldiers would return to the camp believing that civilians here enjoyed endless supplies. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, and several of the men nodded quietly as they continued watching the activity inside. Carl did not answer immediately, but he continued observing the diners carefully while the guards finished speaking with the owner. The people inside behaved naturally, laughing occasionally and speaking across the tables while the waitress carried more plates from the kitchen. Nothing about their movements suggested that they were part of a staged performance. As the guards finally signaled for the prisoners to approach the entrance, Carl took one last look through the wide window and felt a strange mixture of curiosity and doubt forming in his mind. If the food inside the diner was truly ordinary for this town, then the life of civilians in America might be very different from what the prisoners had always believed. The guards finally motioned for the prisoners to move closer to the entrance, and the group walked slowly toward the diner while the warm light from the windows spread across the gravel lot beneath their feet. As Carl approached the doorway, he could hear the sounds inside more clearly now, including the quiet clatter of plates against the counter, the low murmur of conversation between customers, and the steady hum of a coffee machine working behind the bar. When the door opened, the smell of cooking became stronger, carrying the scent of grilled meat and fresh bread into the evening air. The owner of the diner stepped aside politely to allow the prisoners and their guards to enter, and several customers turned briefly in their seats to watch the unusual group crossing the floor. Carl paused for a moment just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the brighter lighting while he studied the room more carefully. The diner appeared larger from the inside than it had from the street, with rows of booths along the walls and a long counter running nearly the entire length of the room. Chrome stools stood evenly spaced in front of the counter where several customers sat eating while speaking casually with the waitress. Behind the counter, a man wearing a white shirt worked beside a flat metal grill where several pieces of meat cooked slowly in the heat. Steam rose from the surface as he turned the food with a metal spatula, and the sound of the grill created a soft background rhythm that blended with the conversations happening throughout the room. Carl noticed the plates immediately. Several customers were eating meals that appeared far larger than anything the prisoners had received in camp kitchens. Thick slices of bread rested beside pieces of meat and potatoes arranged across the plates, and small cups of coffee stood near the edges of the tables while customers continued eating without any sign that the portions were unusual. The waitress moved between the tables with practiced ease, carrying another plate from the kitchen toward a man seated near the counter. She placed the dish in front of him and spoke briefly before continuing to another table where two customers were finishing their meals. Carl slowly walked further into the room with the other prisoners while the guards remained near the entrance. The civilians continued eating and talking with only occasional glances toward the group of German soldiers observing the diner. One of the prisoners beside Carl leaned closer and whispered quietly in German that the food looked far too generous to be real. In Germany, restaurants had gradually been forced to reduce their portions as shortages increased, and many places had closed completely when ingredients became impossible to obtain. Here the opposite seemed to be happening. Carl stepped near the counter where a customer finished eating and pushed his empty plate slightly forward. The waitress returned a moment later, collected the dish, and replaced the cup beside him with fresh coffee poured from a glass pot. The action felt simple and routine, yet Carl noticed how easily the service continued without hesitation. No one appeared worried about conserving food or limiting how much each customer received. Behind the counter, the cook placed another portion of meat onto the grill while reaching for several pieces of bread stacked neatly beside the stove. The shelves behind him held containers filled with ingredients arranged in careful order, and the sight suggested that the diner expected to continue serving meals long into the night. Carl glanced toward the booths along the wall where several people continued eating quietly, their conversations relaxed and unhurried. The atmosphere inside the diner felt comfortable and ordinary, as though the presence of the prisoners had done little to interrupt the evening routine. A thought passed through Carl's mind again, the same one that had been whispered outside. Perhaps the Americans had chosen this diner specifically to create an impression. If the prisoners returned to the camp describing large plates of food served openly in a roadside restaurant, the story alone might convince others that the United States possessed resources far beyond what many soldiers believed. Yet as Carl continued watching the customers and staff moving naturally around the room, he began to notice something that made the explanation feel less certain. Nothing about the diner suggested preparation. The people inside behaved as if this evening was no different from any other night. Carl remained near the counter while the other prisoners spread quietly through the room, observing the diner with the same mixture of curiosity and disbelief that had followed them since arriving. The longer they stayed inside, the more details began revealing themselves, and each one seemed to make the scene feel even more difficult to explain as a simple display arranged for their visit. A man seated 2 stools away from Carl finished his meal and pushed his plate slightly toward the edge of the counter. The waitress returned almost immediately, collecting the empty dish and replacing it with a fresh cup of coffee before asking if he wanted anything else. The customer shook his head with a relaxed smile and continued reading a newspaper resting beside his plate. Carl noticed that detail carefully. The newspaper lay open across the counter with several pages folded neatly beneath the man's hand, and the printed headlines confirmed that the war still dominated the news even in this distant Texas town. Yet the customer reading those pages appeared calm and unhurried, as though the conflict existed far away from the quiet diner where he now sat finishing his meal. Behind the counter, the cook continued working at the grill, placing another portion of meat onto the hot metal surface while the steady sound of cooking filled the room. Steam rose from the grill and drifted toward the ceiling where several ceiling fans turned slowly above the tables. Carl watched the cook carefully as he prepared another plate. The man worked with confident movements, assembling the meal with the practiced routine of someone who had repeated the same process many times before. He placed a thick slice of bread beside the meat before adding a portion of potatoes from a metal container resting near the grill. The plate was then pushed gently toward the waitress, who carried it across the room to a booth where 2 customers were waiting. One of the prisoners standing near the wall leaned slightly forward to study the plate as it passed him, and the expression on his face suggested the same thought shared by many of the others. The food looked real. Not a small sample arranged to impress visitors, but a full meal prepared exactly the way the other customers expected to receive it. Carl slowly turned his head toward the kitchen area again, noticing that several shelves behind the cook held additional ingredients stored in metal containers and glass jars. The supplies appeared organized rather than limited, suggesting that the diner had enough food available to continue serving customers throughout the evening. Another man entered the diner through the front door while the prisoners watched. He removed his hat, greeted the waitress casually, and walked toward an empty stool at the counter as if nothing about the scene felt unusual to him. Within minutes, he was served a plate similar to the others. Carl listened carefully as quiet conversation continued around the room. The civilians spoke about work, local events, and the warm weather outside, while occasionally mentioning news from the war reported in the newspaper. What struck Carl most was how ordinary the tone of those conversations sounded. No one spoke as if food were scarce or difficult to obtain. No one counted portions or discussed ration limits. Instead, the customers focused on their meals and the routine details of their daily lives. One of the prisoners near the door whispered again that the Americans might have filled the diner with extra supplies just before bringing them inside, hoping to create a convincing illusion of abundance. Carl considered the possibility for a moment. Yet as he watched the cook prepare another plate and the waitress carry it to a table, the explanation felt increasingly difficult to accept. The movements of the staff looked too natural, the customers too relaxed, and the steady rhythm of service too familiar for the scene to be part of a temporary performance. If the food inside the diner had been arranged only for the prisoners to see, then everyone in the room would have needed to act carefully to maintain the illusion. Instead, the people around them behaved exactly as they would on any ordinary evening. Carl slowly moved away from the counter and walked toward one of the empty booths along the wall, giving himself a wider view of the diner while the quiet activity of the room continued around him. From that position, he could observe both the customers seated at the tables and the staff working behind the counter. And the longer he watched, the more the place felt like a genuine part of the town rather than a display arranged for visitors. The steady rhythm of the diner never seemed to pause. The cook continued preparing meals at the grill while the waitress moved between the tables carrying plates, refilling coffee cups, and collecting empty dishes from customers who had finished eating. Each action followed naturally from the one before it, forming a routine that looked practiced rather than staged. Carl noticed that another car had arrived outside the window. Two men stepped out and walked toward the entrance while speaking casually with each other, and within moments they had taken seats at the counter where menus were placed in front of them. The prisoners exchanged quiet looks again. If the diner had been prepared specifically for their visit, the arrival of new customers would have complicated the plan. Yet the men who entered behaved as though the evening was unfolding exactly as expected, greeting the waitress and ordering their meals without hesitation. Carl leaned slightly toward the window beside the booth and watched the street outside. The road remained quiet except for an occasional car passing through the town, and the warm yellow light from the diner spread across the pavement in a soft reflection. Inside, the customers continued eating while talking calmly among themselves. One man laughed quietly at something his companion had said while cutting a piece of meat from his plate, and the relaxed mood of the conversation made the atmosphere inside the diner feel almost peaceful. Carl realized that this calm routine was what unsettled him most. During the final years of the war in Europe, restaurants and cafes had gradually become places filled with tension and uncertainty. Conversations often turned toward shortages, ration cards, or news from the front lines. People spoke carefully about food because the amount available was limited and unpredictable. Yet here the atmosphere felt completely different. No one seemed worried about whether the kitchen would run out of ingredients. The cook continued preparing meals with the same steady pace, while the waitress delivered plates that looked just as generous as the ones served earlier. Carl watched as the two men who had recently entered the diner received their meals. The plates looked no different from the others, filled with the same combination of bread, meat, and potatoes arranged neatly across the surface. One of the prisoners standing near the entrance murmured again that the Americans must have chosen this particular diner because it was well supplied, hoping that the prisoners would return to the camp and describe what they had seen. The explanation still seemed possible, yet Carl could not ignore the small details that suggested something more ordinary. The shelves behind the counter remained filled with ingredients. The customers continued arriving without interruption, and the staff showed no sign that their supplies were limited. Everything about the diner felt normal. Carl rested his hands lightly on the edge of the booth table and looked once more around the room. The warm lighting, the smell of cooking food, and the steady sound of quiet conversation created an atmosphere that reminded him of evenings from another time before the war had reshaped so much of the world. For a brief moment, he wondered whether this simple roadside diner represented something larger about the country around them. If places like this truly operated every night in towns across America, then the prisoners might have been witnessing a side of the war they had never been told about. After several minutes inside the diner, the guards quietly signaled that it was time for the prisoners to leave, and the group slowly began moving toward the entrance while the activity inside the room continued almost exactly as it had before they arrived. The customers remained seated at their tables finishing their meals. The waitress continued carrying plates between the counter and the booths, and the cook behind the grill prepared another portion of food, with the same steady routine that had filled the room with warmth and the smell of cooking. Carl walked toward the door with the others, taking one final look at the counter where several customers were still eating while reading newspapers or speaking casually with the waitress. The scene had not changed during their short visit, and the simple consistency of the diner made the experience feel even more difficult to explain. When the door opened and the prisoners stepped back outside, the cooler evening air of the Texas road replaced the warmth of the kitchen behind them. The yellow light from the windows spilled across the gravel again, and for a moment Carl paused near the truck while the guards counted the group before allowing them to climb back into the vehicle. From where he stood, he could still see the inside of the diner through the wide front window. A customer near the counter lifted his coffee cup while the waitress returned with another plate from the kitchen, placing it carefully in front of a man seated in one of the booths. The movement looked ordinary, almost peaceful. Carl climbed into the back of the truck and sat along the wooden bench while the others settled around him. A few of the prisoners spoke quietly in German as the engine started, repeating the same question that had followed them since the moment they first saw the plates of food inside the diner. Had the Americans arranged the entire scene to influence them, or had they simply allowed the prisoners to witness an ordinary evening in a small Texas town? As the truck slowly pulled away from the roadside building, the warm light of the diner began fading behind them. The windows grew smaller while the dark road stretched ahead through the quiet countryside surrounding the town. Carl leaned slightly against the wooden side rail and looked back once more at the glowing building before it finally disappeared behind a row of trees along the road. The image of the plates on the counter remained clear in his mind, not because of their size alone, but because of how naturally they had been served. Inside the camp, meals arrived according to strict schedules and were distributed in careful portions that rarely changed. Yet inside that diner the plates had appeared generous and the kitchen had continued working without hesitation. The truck continued moving through the darkness while the conversation among the prisoners gradually faded into silence. Each of them seemed to be thinking about the same quiet realization forming slowly in their minds. If the food inside that small roadside diner had truly been ordinary for the town, then the life of civilians in America might be very different from the version many soldiers had imagined during the war. The truck returned to the camp later that evening, and as the prisoners climbed down from the vehicle and walked back toward their barracks, the memory of the diner followed them more strongly than anyone had expected. What they had witnessed inside that small roadside building had lasted less than an hour, yet the experience quietly unsettled many of the assumptions they had carried with them since the beginning of the war. Inside the barracks, the story spread quickly from one group of men to another. The prisoners who had visited the town described the long counter, the cook working behind the grill, and the plates of food served openly to the customers sitting inside the diner. Some listeners reacted with disbelief, insisting that the Americans must have prepared the scene carefully before bringing the prisoners there. According to that explanation, the generous meals and well-stocked kitchen were meant to create a powerful impression. If the prisoners returned to the camp convinced that American civilians enjoyed abundant supplies of food, the story alone might influence how they viewed the country holding them captive. Yet the men who had stood inside the diner remembered something else that made the explanation less convincing. The people inside the building had behaved naturally. They had spoken with one another in relaxed voices, finished their meals without hurry, and continued their conversations while the prisoners observed them. No one had acted as though the evening was unusual, and the staff inside the diner had prepared each plate with the same routine confidence they likely showed every night. For Carl Ritter, the most striking part of the experience was not the size of the meals themselves, but the quiet normality surrounding them. The cook at the grill, the waitress carrying coffee cups across the room, and the customers reading newspapers at the counter had all moved through the evening with a calm rhythm that suggested this was simply another ordinary night. The visit did not change Carl's situation as a prisoner, and it did not alter the uncertain course of the war unfolding across the ocean. Yet the brief glimpse of civilian life in that Texas town introduced a small doubt into the picture of the world he had carried in his mind for years. If the simple diner they had visited truly represented everyday life for many Americans, then the resources supporting the country might be far greater than the prisoners had once imagined. Years later, when former prisoners reflected on their time in American camps, moments like that short visit to a roadside diner often remain surprisingly clear in their memories. The warm lights spilling through the windows, the smell of food drifting from the kitchen, and the steady routine of people enjoying their evening meal had offered a glimpse of a society whose daily life continued with remarkable stability even during wartime. For the prisoners who stood quietly inside that diner on a Texas road, the experience revealed something that could not easily be dismissed. It showed them that the war did not shape every corner of the world in the same way. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.